The year was 1966, and China was gripped by a fever that began in the mind of one man, Mao Zedong. After years of political struggle, he sought to reassert his control over the Communist Party and the entire nation. His weapon would not be guns or armies, but ideology, fear, and mass mobilization. Mao declared the launch of the Cultural Revolution, a campaign to root out counter-revolutionaries, capitalist roaders, and anyone deemed an enemy of his vision. In reality, it was a war against China's own people, where suspicion became a death sentence. Schools, universities, and workplaces erupted into chaos as Mao's words spread like wildfire. Young students, intoxicated by revolutionary zeal, formed militant groups known as the Red Guards. They swore loyalty to Mao and took it upon themselves to cleanse society of poisonous weeds. The Red Guards became enforcers of terror. With armbands and Mao's little red book in hand, they stormed classrooms, offices, and neighborhoods, hunting for intellectuals, teachers, and officials. Those accused were dragged before screaming crowds to face humiliation and violence. Public denunciations became daily spectacles. Professors, writers, and even former party members were forced to kneel on broken glass or iron bars while mobs spat on them, slapped their faces, and shouted accusations. The victims' crimes were often as simple as reading foreign books or wearing Western-style clothing. The most infamous punishment was the struggle session. Victims were paraded before huge crowds with placards hung around their necks declaring their alleged sins. They were beaten with belts, sticks, or fists, forced to bow until their spines ached, and insulted until they lost all dignity. Some were made to wear dunce caps with phrases like "enemy of the people" or "capitalist dog." Others were smeared with ink, tar, or paint, turning them into grotesque caricatures while children laughed and adults shouted. Humiliation was not enough. Blood was demanded. Teachers, once respected, became special targets. Red Guards stormed schools, dragged elderly professors into courtyards, and forced them to confess crimes they never committed. Many were beaten to death by their own students. Others, broken by shame and despair, threw themselves from rooftops. The violence spread beyond schools. Ordinary people turned on neighbors, colleagues, and even family members. Children betrayed parents, and spouses denounced each other to prove loyalty to Mao. Fear corroded the bonds of trust, leaving betrayal as the only shield. Mao encouraged this madness from above. His words were treated as sacred scripture, and every citizen was expected to memorize and recite passages from the Little Red Book. Those who hesitated, stumbled, or showed doubt faced punishment. In villages, the Cultural Revolution unleashed witch hunts against landlords and rich peasants. Families who had once owned a cow or a patch of land decades earlier were suddenly branded as class enemies. They were dragged into public squares, beaten with hoes, and sometimes executed on the spot. Religious figures were also persecuted. Temples were ransacked, statues smashed, and sacred texts burned in bonfires. Priests, monks, and nuns were beaten and forced to renounce their faith. Some were paraded through towns in chains as symbols of superstition. The psychological torment was as brutal as the physical beatings. Victims were forced to confess repeatedly, inventing crimes they never committed just to end the torture. Many were pressured to denounce loved ones in order to save themselves, creating deep scars that lasted generations. In Beijing, the capital, Red Guards turned their fury on cultural heritage. Ancient books were torn apart, paintings destroyed, and historic relics smashed with hammers. What could not be destroyed was desecrated, all in the name of purity. Even loyal party officials were not safe. Mao used the chaos to eliminate rivals, accusing them of betraying the revolution. Senior leaders were dragged into struggle sessions, beaten and imprisoned. Their families faced public shame, often reduced to starvation and ruin. The army eventually joined the crackdown, but not to stop the violence, rather to spread it further. Soldiers marched into towns to reinforce Red Guard purges, adding military force to ideological terror. Entire communities were cleansed of those deemed impure. Mass killings began to follow. In Guangxi province, entire villages were wiped out under the accusation of harboring counter-revolutionaries. Reports describe people hacked with machetes, shot in fields, or drowned in rivers, while survivors were forced to applaud the slaughter. For many, survival meant hiding their education, destroying family heirlooms, and erasing all traces of personal history. A person's past became a weapon that others could use to condemn them. Even the hint of foreign influence, an English word, a foreign song, could bring a beating. Children grew up in this chaos, learning not kindness, but cruelty. They were taught that violence against class enemies was honorable. A new generation was molded, not with lessons of compassion, but with the sound of fists, the cries of neighbors, and the endless chanting of Mao's words. By the end of the first waves of the Cultural Revolution, millions had already suffered. Countless were tortured in schools, villages, and workplaces. Tens of thousands lay dead, and the machinery of terror was only gaining momentum. What began as a political purge had turned into a social war where anyone could become an enemy overnight. Mao had unleashed a force that devoured his people, leaving behind rivers of blood, mountains of humiliation, and scars too deep to heal quickly. The Red Storm had only begun, and China was entering one of the darkest chapters in its long history. The nightmare of humiliation, beatings, and mass killings would spread further in the years ahead, crushing opposition with brutality beyond imagination. The Cultural Revolution, once unleashed, did not remain confined to schools and city streets. It expanded into every corner of China, reaching deep into villages, workplaces, prisons, and even the army itself. What began as humiliation and beatings evolved into systematic terror and mass killings. Red Guards multiplied in number and became more violent with each passing month. Their loyalty to Mao was displayed through brutality. Every punch, every kick, every public trial was proof of revolutionary devotion. The blood of class enemies was seen as a badge of honor. Teachers, once respected, continued to suffer horribly. Reports tell of professors locked in cages, beaten daily by their own students, and forced to crawl on their knees for hours until they collapsed. Some died from exhaustion, others from sheer despair. In factories, workers accused of counter-revolutionary thoughts were tied to poles and flogged in front of their colleagues. Their faces were smeared with black ink, their hair cut into grotesque styles to shame them, and their families were forced to watch the torment. Confession was no escape. Victims who admitted to imaginary crimes were beaten for dishonesty, while those who denied charges were beaten for stubbornness. The cycle was endless: confession, humiliation, and pain until death or madness. Suicides surged across the country. Intellectuals leapt from rooftops, drank poison, or hanged themselves rather than endure more torture. Families sometimes killed themselves together, fearing that one denunciation would doom them all. Prisons overflowed with the accused. Detention centers became hellholes where inmates were crammed into dark, airless cells, fed scraps and beaten daily. Some were forced to kneel on iron bars for hours, their knees splitting open and bleeding into the dirt. Psychological torture became common. Prisoners were forced to memorize Mao's quotations, recite them endlessly, and denounce themselves while crowds jeered. Those who stumbled over a line faced kicks, whips, or iron rods. The violence escalated into killings. In provinces like Guangxi and Yunnan, entire communities were massacred. Villages were ordered to eliminate bad elements, and peasants turned on neighbors with knives, hoes, and rifles. Rivers ran red as bodies floated downstream. Cannibalism even appeared in Guangxi during the height of the terror. Reports describe villagers cooking and eating the flesh of class enemies as a grotesque ritual to prove loyalty to Mao. These acts were not isolated. They were encouraged by local officials who sought to show zeal. In the countryside, people with the wrong family background were exterminated. Descendants of landlords, rich peasants, or anyone linked to old elites were hunted down. Entire family lines were destroyed, children beaten to death simply because of their ancestry. Women were not spared. Many suffered sexual violence during public trials. Red Guards stripped women naked in front of crowds, mocking them as symbols of decadence. Some were raped in detention, while others were mutilated and killed as punishment for imagined crimes. Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and the so-called Gang of Four fueled the madness. They demanded harsher purges, stricter loyalty, and deeper bloodshed. Their speeches gave justification for cruelty, ensuring that the campaign spiraled even further out of control. The army's involvement made the terror even more systematic. Soldiers carried out mass arrests, executions, and purges. Whole towns were sealed off, with suspected counter-revolutionaries lined up and shot in fields while their families were forced to cheer. In Inner Mongolia, tens of thousands were accused of being spies for Mongolia. Entire communities were tortured with electric shocks, burned with hot irons, and beaten with clubs. Many were executed, and countless others crippled for life. Tibet saw monasteries destroyed and monks beaten to death. Sacred scriptures were piled high and set on fire, while Buddhist statues were smashed with hammers. Those who resisted were dragged into squares and publicly executed. Fear poisoned every household. Children continued betraying their parents to avoid suspicion, while spouses turned on each other. One careless word could bring Red Guards crashing through the door, dragging someone into the street for a struggle session. Executions became public events. Thousands gathered in stadiums to watch condemned prisoners paraded across platforms. Accused of treason or espionage, they were beaten, insulted, and then shot in the back of the head while crowds shouted slogans. In some regions, local officials organized killing quotas. Villages were ordered to produce a certain number of executions to demonstrate revolutionary commitment. Innocent people were killed simply to meet numbers, their bodies dumped into mass graves. Those spared death often faced re-education through labor. Millions were sent to remote camps where they endured backbreaking work, starvation, and constant political indoctrination. Many never returned, their bones buried in unmarked pits. Starvation was itself a form of torture. Prisoners in labor camps were fed thin gruel, sometimes mixed with dirt or weeds. Guards laughed as inmates fought over scraps, beating those who begged for more food. Psychological scars ran deep. Survivors described the constant sound of screams echoing from cells, the smell of blood in the air, and the sight of broken bodies carried away daily. Sleep became impossible, for nightmares and reality had become the same. By the late 1960s, death toll estimates reached into the millions. Official figures remained disputed, but the evidence of mass killings, torture, and persecution was undeniable. Mao's revolution of purity was leaving only corpses and despair. And still the campaign raged on. Mao had succeeded in crushing opposition, but the price was rivers of blood and a nation terrorized into silence. The Cultural Revolution was no longer a campaign. It was an unending nightmare consuming China itself. The escalation had only hardened. Families were destroyed, communities shattered, and history erased. What remained was fear, a fear that lived in every home, every classroom, and every prison cell across the vast nation. The storm had grown darker, and the killings multiplied. The next phase would see Mao's vision tighten its grip, driving the people deeper into suffering, indoctrination, and unrelenting terror. By the early 1970s, China was a nation scarred beyond recognition. The Cultural Revolution had devoured millions of lives, left countless more broken, and reduced families, schools, and entire communities to ashes of fear. Yet the storm was not over. The violence, once unleashed, could not be easily contained. Even as Mao began to rein in the Red Guards, the damage they had inflicted was irreversible. The spirit of cruelty lingered in villages, factories, and prisons where people continued to suffer daily. Red Guards themselves became victims of the chaos they created. Many were sent into the countryside in Mao's down-to-the-countryside movement, ostensibly to learn from peasants. In reality, it was exile, forcing millions of youths into hard labor camps. There they faced hunger, disease, and isolation. Once proud enforcers of Mao's ideology, they became disillusioned, trapped in remote farms without education, medicine, or hope. For many, this punishment was a slow death sentence. In the cities, the purges continued. Party officials who had once supported Mao were accused of treachery and dragged into prisons. Generals, ministers, and governors were beaten in public, stripped of power, and sometimes executed. Nobody was safe, not even Mao's closest allies. The Gang of Four, Jiang Qing, Jiang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen, tightened their grip on culture and politics. They ordered harsher censorship, controlling plays, films, and books. Only revolutionary operas and propaganda praising Mao were allowed to exist. Art, history, and literature disappeared. Libraries remained empty, temples lay in ruins, and ancient traditions were branded as poisonous remnants of the past. What survived was rewritten to glorify Mao, while the rest was lost to flames and destruction. The people endured endless propaganda rallies. Loudspeakers blared Mao's quotations from dawn until night. Workers had to begin their day shouting slogans, raising their fists, and denouncing imaginary enemies before they could even touch their tools. Meanwhile, prisons swelled with counter-revolutionaries. Inside, torture became routine. Prisoners were strapped to tiger benches, their legs crushed under heavy bricks until bones snapped. Others were burned with cigarettes or whipped until flesh peeled away. Women faced particularly cruel fates. Many were subjected to sexual abuse by guards, forced into humiliating confessions, or paraded naked through streets. Mothers were sometimes beaten in front of their children, used as examples of decadence. Executions remained a grim spectacle. Public rallies in stadiums saw prisoners kneeling on platforms, heads bowed beneath placards naming their crimes. A pistol shot to the head followed, their bodies carried away as the crowd chanted Mao's name. In provinces like Henan and Hunan, entire families vanished overnight. Local officials demanded killings to prove their loyalty. Quotas were enforced, so many enemies per village. Innocent farmers were dragged from beds and executed simply to fill numbers. The psychological toll on survivors was unbearable. People lived in constant fear, never knowing if a friend, neighbor, or even child might denounce them. Whispered conversations died out, replaced by silence and suspicion. Even nature became a tool of terror. Some prisoners were forced to stand outside in freezing winters, doused in water until ice encased their bodies. Others were locked in cages with little food, forced to crawl like animals for scraps of rice. Labor camps claimed millions of lives. Prisoners starved while breaking rocks, digging ditches, or hauling timber. Guards mocked them as they collapsed, calling them filth, unworthy of Mao's revolution. Graves filled with nameless bodies scattered across the countryside. The campaign also tore at the nation's future. An entire generation grew up without proper education. Their schools turned into battlegrounds of ideology. Science, medicine, and progress withered, while children memorized slogans instead of learning knowledge. Even Mao's health began to decline. As he grew older and weaker, paranoia consumed him. He saw enemies everywhere, ordering more purges to ensure his absolute control. His obsession with power outweighed the suffering of millions. Yet whispers of discontent began to spread. Some party officials, quietly horrified by the destruction, started plotting for the day Mao would no longer rule. They endured humiliation in silence, waiting for history to shift. By 1976, Mao's reign was nearing its end. His death on September 9th sent shockwaves across the nation. For many, it was the end of an era of fear, though the scars would remain for generations. Shortly after, the Gang of Four was arrested, their downfall signaling the collapse of the Cultural Revolution. For the first time in a decade, China began to slowly emerge from the shadow of blood and terror. The numbers left behind were staggering. Estimates suggest between 1.5 to 2 million people were killed, though some argue the death toll was far higher. Tens of millions were persecuted, tortured, or imprisoned. Nearly every family carried wounds. The physical damage was immense: destroyed temples, burned books, and lost art. But the psychological damage was worse. Trust between people had been shattered, replaced by suspicion and silence that lasted for decades. Survivors bore invisible scars. Teachers who once inspired generations became broken shells. Children who denounced their parents lived with guilt. Entire communities never recovered from the betrayal and bloodshed that had consumed them. The Cultural Revolution, meant to strengthen Mao's rule and purify China, instead left devastation. It was an era where humiliation, torture, and murder were used as tools of ideology, crushing not only opposition, but also the very soul of the nation. As the years passed, China tried to bury the memory, but the ghosts of that time could not be erased. The screams of the tortured, the cries of the humiliated, and the silence of the executed lingered in the shadows of history. The nightmare had ended, but the scars endured. Mao's revolution had promised a new society, yet it delivered only terror, leaving behind one of the darkest legacies in human history.